Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well. This webinar, which will last over the next 50 to 55 minutes, is being recorded. You'll get copies of the slides at the very end of the webinar. There'll be a contact details for you to be able to get the slides and a copy of the recording. Today, we're going to be looking at what's happening to the funding of access to HE diplomas in England. It's an update that takes account of the changes that were announced before Christmas. That's affecting mostly the organisational side of funding, moving the funding of adult skills from the Department for Education to Department for Work and Pensions, which obviously will have implications for us in future. There'll be opportunities if you can use the chat facility, which is open now, to obviously ask questions. My colleagues from Ascentus will look at those questions to make sure that I cover them either directly or obviously indirectly at the end of the session. If there's any outstanding questions, we'll give ourselves 5 minutes at the very end of the session. The opportunity to ask questions is based on you having you are currently a provider of access to HE diplomas. That includes obviously any pre-access provision you might be putting on. And what I'll try and do is give you a flavour of some of the things that we know are starting to impact on us, particularly in this world of increased devolution of adult skills funding. So I'm going to start by having a look at, well, where does the funding for access diplomas come from? What are the main funding streams in England? Well, we've got the Adult Skills Fund, previously known as the Adult Education Budget, which until recently was actually the responsibility of the DFE, taking over those responsibilities from what was previously known as the Education and Skills Funding Agency, ESFA. But of course, an increasing proportion of the funding for adult skills, including access to HE, is now resting with devolved authorities. Now, some of these are combined, mayoral combined authorities, what we call MCAs, mayoral combined authorities with an elected mayor. Example, South Yorkshire, West Midlands, Greater Manchester. It could be delegated authority, which is what Greater London Authority has, the GLA. And of course, now increasingly, with devolution now going to different types of devolved authorities, such as county councils and other strategic organisations, then you'll see that that's going to increase in the next few years. For example, Cornwall, because Cornwall is not a combined authority, it's a council-based devolved authority. And we see different shapes and sizes of these devolution deals as we go through the next few years. The main thing here is that that split between what the DFE is responsible for and the DWP is an important split, and I'll pick that up in the next few seconds. For those adults who are not funded by the Adult Skills Fund, they're funded by what we call the Advanced Learner Loans. And that, by the way, is decreasing in importance, as you'll see, as more and more adults are being funded by an extended Adult Skills Fund, particularly focusing on those adults that haven't got a level 3 qualification, known as the free courses for jobs offer. And I'll come back to that and explain that change to you as well. There are some adults, by the way, who fund their own access to HE programs. We've got several at the college I'm chair of, who will pay in full for the cost of their access to HE provision, or that might be paid for by a sponsor, such as maybe the Ministry of Defence or someone else like that. And then we've got 19 to 25s, that's up to 25, they're usually 24 when you start the programme. These are any adults with an education healthcare plan. Please be aware of this. Any adult who's 19 to 25 who's got an education healthcare plan is not funded through the Adult Skills Fund. They're funded through the 16 to 19 formula, what we call the study programme formula. And of course, if you are a provider, maybe a local authority or independent provider that hasn't got a contract to deliver 16 to 19 funded students, then you will not be able to pick up anyone with these characteristics. There are obviously adults who are 19 to 25 with special needs, but they don't have an education healthcare care plan, which is a statutory assessment of their individual needs that involves obviously education, health, and social care. Now, I know that we always get a question at the beginning of this. Well, what about 18-year-olds who might be more suitable to do an access provision rather than maybe, say, A-levels. There are some exceptions, and I know some of awarding bodies will allow some exceptions. It's not normal. It's not the normal case. Most of the adults would be 19 and over on the first day, on the first meeting of the class. And in fact, it's got to be 19 and over on the 31st of August in the year in which they start the access provision. But there might be some exceptions. One thing to note, by the way, is we have got some 18-year-olds doing pre-access type programs funded through the study program, but that is not a full level 3. It'd be a mixture of maybe GCSE retakes and maybe a personal development program or an introduction to a particular subject area which they might study further as an access to HE student. But as I said, it's not normal to have 18-year-olds funded on access to HE. So those are the main sources of funding. About 32 to 34,000 adults on access courses in any one year, a whole range of subject areas from business studies right through to medicine, health and social care, science, etc., etc. So you've got the full range here. So what are the main changes that are affecting us in this current year, 25-26? And don't forget, we're getting very close now to getting some idea of what's going to happen in 26-27 in terms of maybe changes in the rates of funding, changes in the conditions. And certainly that's multiplied by the fact that if you're operating as a national provider of access to HE, and I know some of you do, then you're going to have to be aware of the fact there could be very different arrangements in these devolved authorities. So those of you maybe who all of your adults are residents of Greater Manchester, you only have to worry about how Greater Manchester Combined Authority is going to decide its priorities, its funding rates, its funding rules, any flexibilities it introduces at local level. And similarly for the West Midlands or the West of England or whichever combined authority or whichever devolved authority you're covered by. Well, originally, when we looked at the first changes that occurred in 25-26, the DFE took over all the responsibilities of the ESFA. Now that obviously is now changed to be the DWP, but I'll cover that in a second. A lot more devolved arrangements in place this year. So for example, Cornwall is now a devolved authority. The East Midlands Counties Combined Authority that covers myself in Derbyshire is now a devolved authority, as is York and North Yorkshire. We've got colleagues here from York. Before we start looking at the devolved changes, the actual Adult Skills Fund was reduced by about 6% in terms of the allocation nationally. And that's obviously going to affect those of you who are not covered by these devolved arrangements. So that's quite a significant cut in money terms. It could even be bigger when you start to take out of inflation. There was protection, however, within this thing called the Free Courses for Jobs offer. Now, the Free Courses for Jobs offer originally started as an extension of the Level 3 entitlement. Now, as you know, 19 to 23-year-olds in England who haven't yet got their first full Level 3 qualification, that's the equivalent of 2 A-levels, are entitled to be fully funded. So they don't have to find 50% of the cost, for example, of an access course. Now, that was extended to include adults who were 19 to 23, who were maybe unemployed, who might have already had the equivalent of a first full Level 3, but might needed one to change their career, to upskill. That was extended to include adults who are unemployed over the age of 23, that's 24 and upwards, who might need a Level 3 program to be able to either go into a job or retrain if they were moving from one occupation to another. And of course, that Free Courses for Jobs offer wasn't just at Level 3, it could be at higher qual levels as well, but most of them were Level 3. It's part of the Level 3 entitlement. Now that was changed most recently to include some Level 2 qualifications, which basically, irrespective of your age, irrespective of your prior attainment, you could have a degree, you could retrain at Level 3, but now it is extended to include Level 2 in the construction industry, where there's a significant shortage of skills at Level 2 and above. So something about the Free Courses for Jobs offer that, and I'll come back to it because in some devolved authorities, access to HE is included in the Free Courses for Jobs offer. And that obviously extends the amount of funding that's available for those learners that might want to do an access to HE diploma. For those of you who are working with residents in devolved authorities, then there's been a 3% cut in the adult skills allocation to those devolved authorities. Now, how they have dealt with that 3% was up to them. There have been different ways in which they've applied the cuts. Some have simply reduced the number of learners that they're covering. Others have maybe changed their priorities within a reduced budget, maybe more, what do you call it, construction, more engineering, more digital. Others might, of course, have just simply not increased the levels of funding to keep pace with inflation so that they've been able to make better use of whatever budget they've got. Something to be aware of. Now, in terms of the departmental changes, this is very much part of the reshuffle that occurred at government level, where we've got two areas of responsibility now for skills. The DFE basically continues to have responsibility for 16, 17 and 18-year-olds on study programs and T levels. It's still got responsibility for young people's careers, and it's the main agency that looks after higher education. So that's that sort of split. The DWP has taken on responsibilities at national level for adult skills. And obviously then you've got the devolved authorities that share it with them. It's also responsible for adult careers and also responsible for apprenticeships. Now, when we say apprenticeships, responsibility for apprenticeships of all ages, that includes young people. But it's anyone who's chosen the work-based learning route. So just be aware now that whenever we talk about the DFE having national responsibilities, we should have DFE stroke DWP. And for things like access to HE, it is the DWP. So that's an important change that's occurred without looking at the detail of some of the changes that occurred in actual funding itself. Okay, so those are the main changes. And I'll just check at this point if there's any questions, anything. No, as such. Okay. Moving on then. So the Adult Skills Fund, basically, there are different aspects of it. And sometimes this will vary from the national model, which covers about 40% of adult learners. So 60% are covered by devolved arrangements, which is quite a significant change. But if you look at it in its totality, the education and training, sometimes known as the core activities, basically, that's where access to HE sits, along with the first level 2 entitlement, the first level 3 entitlement, those adults that haven't yet got English, maths, digital skills, and a whole range of other programs, what we call the core offer. Separately, except in some combined authorities which haven't gone all the way yet, there's a thing called tailored learning, which includes adult community learning, including outreach, and non-regulated qualification provision. What I call the RARPA type programs, where you're running programs not with nationally recognized qualifications, but with some kind of internal quality assurance and some kind of method for recording outcomes for those learners. Also, outside of the core program is discretionary learner support, which obviously for adults is discretionary. It's up to you, the provider, to decide how much you provide out of your allocation for things like childcare, for residential costs, or where the adult might have some hardship and need some help economically to undertake their study. Now, what you can see there is that obviously within an allocation to a provider, there will be sometimes highlighted elements which are non-qualification bearing or tailored learning. And that is obviously where you've got a bit more freedom to do something which is more akin with community outreach, pre-entry programs, getting people back into learning, whereas the core program tends to be for those learners that have already got some experience of learning and maybe closer to learning and to skills and to employment than other adults. So there's the legal entitlements, which haven't changed. They're still the same. They can be changed, by the way, in combined authorities. So those of you, I don't know, those of you who I know certainly who are in Greater Manchester Combined Authority, their legal entitlement, for example, the first level 2, which is normally only for 19 to 23-year-olds, 19 to 23-year-olds level 3 entitlement is still a national entitlement. That covers access to HE. But it's interesting, in Greater Manchester, the first level 2 entitlement is available for all ages, not just the 19 to 23, but basically any adult who's not got the first level 2, the equivalent of 5 GCSEs, irrespective of their age, their employment status, or their earnings, would be fully funded in Manchester, but that is not the same for every other combined authority, and it's certainly not the same nationally. First level 3 tends to be a national entitlement, which is applied in most combined authorities as well as nationally. But remember, that only relates to 19 to 23-year-olds. So once a learner starts, if a learner starts with you who's over the age of 23, they would normally be expected to contribute 50% of the cost of the course, unless, of course, they were unemployed or they were below the earnings threshold, which can vary from the national rates, or if they were being funded under the Free Courses for Jobs Office. So some exceptions. As I said, skills provision, unemployed, for the unemployed and low wage, that can include pre-access programs, learning in the workplace, and pre-apprenticeships. So that's what I'd call the core offer that's made by most combined authorities. And then obviously any learning support for those learners with learning difficulties and or disabilities. Tailored learning, and I'll just remove my the video for a minute. It includes community learning. And obviously, remember, those of you who are community learning providers, that is a lot of the work that you're doing to get people into learning, return to learning, community-based. Could be English and Maths in the community, it could be ESOL, it could be preparing people for programs, it could be independent living, it could be family-based learning. Non-regulated learning, using some system of RAPA to recognise what people have learnt. And now, of course, we've got a new category, innovative, sort of employer-faced programs, which you might be devising in response to a particular need that's been identified at local level. And then the support funding, again, for all your learners would be discretionary learner support for things like hardship, childcare, residential cost. So when you're looking at an access to HE diploma student, you take account of their age. Are they entitled to it being fully funded? Or if not, then possibly funded through another source, such as maybe a loan. Look at their earnings, look at their age, look at their prior attainment. That's all quite part of the parcel. And then also if there are individual circumstances where they might need help with learning support. Remember, every access to HE student is entitled to learning support if it's been identified, assessed, and you've got a plan of how to provide it, as well as discretionary learner support funding for things like residential cost or childcare costs. So the Adult Skills Fund is the major source here. And of course, you as a provider are free to offer a range of programs, including access to HE diplomas, to take account of what people see as their needs, what they've identified as needs through training needs analysis, the needs of the local labour market, what the progression opportunities are in HE. For many of your learners, that might be local. And then obviously take account of what the circumstances of the learners are. What's their age? First level 3, 19 to 23. Do they need English and Maths, which will be useful, obviously, for progression to HE? Have they got essential digital skills? These are all fully funded. Remember, the essential digital skills entitlement is only available for those learners who are aged, who have not yet attained the level 1 qualification in essential digital skills. That's level 1. However, again, flexibilities can apply. In Greater Manchester, the digital skills entitlement extends to anyone who hasn't yet got the level 2 in digital skills. So again, just a bit of flexibility here. So usually the department, in this case, it could be the Department of, in this case, it would be the Department of Work and Pensions, or the Mayor or Combined Authority or devolved authority will fully fund those learners who haven't yet got a first level 2, if they're unemployed, otherwise they're co-funded. And obviously that's now extended to include people over the age of 24. So if they're 24 and over, again, if they're unemployed. So there's a large number of learners in receipt of universal credit and other forms like job seekers allowance who will be eligible to be fully funded, as well as those learners who are what we call low waged. Now, the low wage level nationally for the current year is set at £25,750. In some combined authorities, it's much higher than that. And we'll be interested to see how much it becomes this year. So here are the legal entitlements nationally agreed. And as I said, these are the de minimis in every combined authority or devolved authority, as well as nationally. First level 2, 19 to 23. First level 3, 19 to 23. English and maths, where a learner hasn't yet got an equivalent of a grade 4 GCSE. And digital skills up to and including level 1, if they're assessed at being below level 1. So these learners don't have to find any proportion of the cost of the tuition, and therefore you're removing a barrier to them joining an access to HE program. I know there's a question, does this extend to pre-access programs? The answer is no, because in most cases, it will not be a first full level 2. It won't be big enough to be a full level 2, which is the equivalent of 5 GCSEs. Although by the time you put them together, it might look like it. You've got to be very careful about that. And also, of course, that some of the other learning aims might not be the equivalent of a full level 2. So but there will be other conditions. That's the point I was going to make. There will be other conditions. Most of our pre-access students are also unemployed, or if they're employed, they're low-waged. And that, by the way, includes their entitlement to benefits as well. So actually, the majority of our learners end up on a pre-access program to be fully funded. If they're doing English and maths as part of their pre-access program, that's fully funded anyway. So you just be aware of these. But by definition, just because you're doing maybe a personal development program or a certificate in employability and training in development skills, it doesn't necessarily mean that will be fully funded. It's got to be at least a full level 2 to be fully funded. So how do you use the legal entitlements to facilitate participation and progression for access to HE learners? A lot of your learners who are 19 to 23 on access courses will not have to find a proportion of the fee, the tuition cost, because it's their first level 3. So for example, one of the reason we've got an 18-year-old is because they did 1A level, but 1A level is not enough to get them into university, but it's not a full level 3. So in effect, they would be eligible to do an access to HE diploma as long as they don't go over the age of 23 and be fully funded for it. So just to clarify that question that one of you has already posed, thank you. And of course, that level 3 offer has now been extended to other adults. So it's not just 19 to 23s, but again, it tends to be those learners who would be seeking employment or further study in a skill that's been identified as a shortage area. So there tends to be priorities given to things like health studies, health and social care, digital, engineering, and construction. But of course, there is a local flexibility which can be applied, and certainly with the combined authorities, and I've already shared some of these with you from Greater Manchester, that you can have other programs that you can put together, such as progression to full level 2, retraining, restarting your career. Any qualification would be eligible for local flexibility is always specified on Find a Learning Aim. Useful for those of you who might be new to funding of access to HE diplomas, always, and Ascentus obviously provides you with the qual code, always check on Find a Learning Aim. Just put Finding a Learning Aim on Google or whatever search you're using, whatever search engine you're using. Find a Learning Aim, put in the code, 400, whatever it is, and up will come the eligibility of that qualification and what it's eligible for. It will always say first level 3. And also check on it. It will tell you what the funding rates are, both nationally, that's the adult skills funding, ASF bit, but also if you go down to MGA, MCA, Mayoral Combined Authority, or GLA, it will tell you what the funding is if it's different from the national rate in a combined authority or a devolved authority. Now, I'll come back to that because some of you have been asking me. I went on to the FALA and then I didn't, and in that list of combined authorities or devolved authorities, I couldn't find my one. Well, the reason is they're using the national rates. So they're using what it appears further up on the Find a Learning Aim under Adult Skills Fund. Non-regulated learning where you use it, and sometimes that can form part of for example, a pre-access program, but here you've got to record and recognize the progress using some system of RARPA to make sure that you check on what learners are actually learning and what outcomes they've got so they can progress further. And then there's what we call sector-based work academies, but very few people progress from a sector-based work academy to an access to HE program, because that tends to be straight into employment with a particular employer in mind. So that's that local flexibility, and there's some examples. So for example, I could use local flexibility as part of a pre-access program. So for example, I've got a student who hasn't yet got maths, so they're going to do a GCSE in maths to get up to the right grade or functional skill. And then they're also doing a level 2 certificate in health and social care professions. Those of you using Ascentis will know that that's an 87 GLH program funded at £8.40 an hour. That basically means that if a student starts that course, you'll get a bit of funding for the GCSE maths, which is about £811 nationally, £811 for the maths, and you also get £731 for the certificate in health and social care. Both of those are assuming that the person starts the course, finishes it, and passes the qualifications. And that's how you might build up, using local flexibility, to build up a pre-access program that might be giving those learners that progression route into health and social care studies at the access to HE diploma level. Just be aware, of course, that learners have got different motives. They might want to test or trial several areas, and they might want to do a bit in construction, a bit in engineering, and maybe in digital. And so you have to make sure that you have the appropriate program that gives them that opportunity to then decide what will be the best option when it comes to doing the full access diploma. So since we've said a little bit about pre-access programs, just check from a show of hands. Just use the chat facility. How many of you are doing currently pre-access provision? Either 1 year or, in some cases, I know 2-year programs, but usually 1 year. How many of you are just doing that? Just indicate with a show of hands or on the chat facility. Yeah, just do us a thumbs up. Thumbs up. Yeah. 1 year program. Thanks, Lindsay. Katie. Yeah. I'm getting a fair idea there. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. I think it's important to recognize that these are programs where it's not just about developing the study skills that are going to be needed for an access to HE diploma. We know how important that is, particularly for adults with some significant gaps since they were last in formal education, but also to make sure they've got the English and maths that they need to be able to progress beyond to obviously whatever the experience is going to be in HE. And it's a nice way of also introducing them to a chosen field of study. For example, I mentioned the level 2 certificate in healthcare professions. I think it's important that we do build that capacity in terms of literacy, numeracy, personal social development, the right sort of, if you want, study skills, and give those learners, wherever they need to, a chance to experience what that program might be before they commit fully to it. Now, it's usually funded through the new funding rates, if it's national, or in the devolved authorities, which don't have slightly different arrangements. But of course, it will also depend on which local authority or which combined authority you're actually operating in. So for example, if you're operating in Cornwall or Greater Manchester or West Midlands or the West of England, you'll find that very often their rates are slightly different from other combined authorities or devolved authorities, and also different from the national rates. And that's one of the confusions that arises when we have devolution. Some of those learners will be fully funded because they're unemployed or they're low-waged, and that's irrespective of their age. Others will have to find 50% of the cost of any element of it, which is not a national entitlement. But let me just remind you, English, maths, digital skills are always fully funded. So you can use the local flexibilities or whatever is available in your locality. Different conditions can exist in different devolved authorities, and just be aware that sometimes that means that there'll be a different rate for even that what do you call it, level 2 certificate in health and social care. There could be even different rates for English, maths, and digital skills. Some of the combined authorities increase the level of funding even for things like GCSEs in English and maths. But also there could be some quals that they won't accept as being eligible to be funded because they don't see it as a priority. This has got to reflect a lot of things are coming out of the locally determined priorities in those devolved authorities. Any questions then on pre-access provision before we move on to how the actual formula is working in 25-26? Just checking. Any other questions? Wait a minute, I've got a question coming up here. Yeah, there's a question from someone about what's happening in one of the combined authorities, that they're not accepting new providers. I think one of the things that we've got to remember is that when devolution tends to occur, the devolved authorities, such as Greater Manchester or East Midlands counties, will not want to have a large number of very small providers that they have to contract with. Not too bad, because usually they start with the colleges, and they'll give them significant allocations because they're grant funded, and the same with larger local authorities. But if you've got what they call a long tail of very small providers, they will often not procure programs from them. And that means that very often you'll be directed to act as a subcontractor to maybe a larger provider. So you might end up saying, well, they don't want a new provider, but we've got a niche. We're brilliant in doing, for example, access to medicine or access to pharmacy. Then you might have to link up with a college. The college would become the prime, and then they'd subcontract the delivery to you, subject to the normal conditions. So just something to be aware of in terms of that question. But it's quite common for them not to have lots of smaller contracts with providers, the smaller providers, even though you might be offering a significant niche or something that no one else does. Or you could even be a grade 1 provider, and that sometimes happens. Okay. So how does the new ASF formula work? It applies to what was formerly known as the adult education budget, the free courses for jobs offer. In some cases, these are now joined together, particularly for those devolved authorities. And basically, it takes a learning aim, such as access to HE Diploma. It applies an hourly rate to it, which can be as low as £6, as high as something higher than that. And then it takes the GLH. Now, the GLH is determined by the awarding body with Ofqual approval. So that would be, in this case, what do you call it? Ascentus. Now, as it is, all of diplomas who are funded through the new funding formula are assumed to be 600 guided learning hours. For the individual learner, you then you multiply that by whatever postal code they come from. About 27% of postal codes carry a disadvantage uplift. And for those of you who are providers in the southeast, including London, there's also an area cost uplift. So you take the funding for that individual learner, which could be just over £3,000. If that learner draws down a 10% disadvantage uplift, 10% is added to that. And then if the delivery is in central London, say Islington, another 30%. So the actual number gets bigger cumulatively as you go along. Now, this replaces a thing that you might be familiar with called the single activity matrix, better known as SAM, which had all the guided learning hours down the left-hand side. I'll show you in a minute. And then all weighted. All of these rates are always weighted. Certain subjects carry a higher weighting than others. Business studies, humanities are weighted at 1. Health and social care weighted higher. IT weighted higher. Construction even higher. Medicine even higher, and then when you get to things like land-based studies, even higher. Now, the one thing to note, by the way, with adults is it doesn't matter, except, of course, that when you're looking at a learner, it doesn't matter how you deliver the learning, whether it be classroom-based, 100%, face-to-face, 100% by distance, or a blended learning approach, it's always the same rate. The index of multiple deprivation is used, that's the 2019 one, but it's very important to note, unlike young people, when you come to an adult funded by the Adult Skills Fund, and it's slightly different for loans, 80% of the funding for that adult is attached on programme, that's retention by the month, and 20% on completion of the programme or achievement of the learning aim if there's a defined learning aim. Now, if you've got a learner who is not eligible to be fully funded, not many of them, by the way, in our college, about 97% of all learners are fully funded, adults, only 3% are expected to find a proportion of the cost of the course, then it's a 50% rate. And by the way, all adults are entitled to claim learning support. You're entitled to claim learning support for them out of your allocation at £150 per month, and that's a de minimis, as long as you have got evidence of their need, you've assessed their need, you've planned to meet their needs, and you've got the appropriate evidence that you've actually met their needs through things like learning support assistance, one-to-one counselling, whatever you're offering as learning support for that student. Now, that's the old matrix, and you'll see that that covered a lot of the things that might be, you know, what we used to call load banded, but these are programs where the hours determine the level of funding. Now, it would be either the GLH or it could be total qualification time, that concept that the higher the level that the adult's learning at, the bigger proportion of total qualification time, which is personal study. Access to HE was always funded at a given rate nationally, where it was a matter of policy, very similar to GCSEs, functional skills, etc. So you can see along the bottom of that second box, access to HE funded through what we call the matrix. Now, just to remind you, some combined authorities are still using the matrix. So even though the access to HE diploma is 600 hours, they will use the former matrix values to determine the baseline. So anything that's weighted at A will be 3,022. Anything weighted at B, such as, for example, education, some aspects of social health and social. If you're talking about weighting at C, that could be things like art and design. It could be IT. Something weighted at D would be music, technology, construction, engineering. And then we've got what we call the specialist rate, which is anything which is land-based or a higher rate of funding if it's being done in a land-based provider. So that's a bit of clarification. Now, I know some of you are going to say, well, why have I put that up? We are using the national rates because we're outside of a combined authority. No, by the way, just in response to the question about pastoral support from Kate, pastoral support is absolutely assumed to be what would be within the core funding. So if you're, for example, offering a learner a GCSE in, say, a GCSE in maths, funded at £811, part of that would be the pastoral support you provide that student. That's part of what we call the core activity, part of the ongoing guidance that you're providing a learner on a programme. The same if they're doing access to HE. Additional learning support is where you've identified that that individual has got a learning difficulty and or disability, and they would not be able to complete the access diploma or the GCSE without you giving them additional support, say one-to-one counselling, help with an amanuensis when they come to do the exams, a reader, extended time for the written parts of the written exams. It might be an LSA to work with them one-to-one in a class. It could be help with literacy, it could be help with numeracy, or it could be obviously adaptations to IT. So Kate, it's not pastoral support, it's the additional support. Every student is assumed to get some form of pastoral or tutorial support as a part of the core funding for that particular learning aim. So I hope that clarifies that. Thanks for the question. Good question. So what are the new national rates? So £6 an hour, the base rate. Low is £7.20 an hour. Remember, access to HE is 600 hours. Medium, £8.40. High, £9.60. Specialist is for land-based studies. In other words, done in a land-based provider. So this would be in an agricultural college, not, for example, a general college that does a bit of horticulture or veterinary or whatever. So, for example, if I take medicine and dentistry, that is now funded at medium, £8.40. So access to nursing with a GLH of 600 hours would earn 600 at £8.40. That's £5,040 per learner. Now, remember, this is before any disadvantage uplift, the postal code of the learner, or any additional delivery costs of being located in the southeast of London, what we call the area cost uplift. Now, of that 5,040, 80% is determined by each month that learner being retained on programme. So you check that they're still attending. 20% when they achieve the diploma or complete the diploma programme. So if we look at, for example, I've just chosen a couple of access, I think 4 access programs. Under the old system, these were the funding rates. What's SAM, single activity matrix. The weighted rates were then divided by the number of hours. And you can see that some of them were being funded only at £5 for an hour. Well, the new national rate is £6 an hour minimum. So that's the base rate. So when you start looking at access to radiography, that's now £8.40. If you look at access to HE, it's still the bottom rate, but it's better than what you got before. Access to HE is the £7.20, the low rate. Access to policing is the £7.20 per hour, the low rate. So the differences in the right-hand column is how much more the new national rate gives you per learner compared to the old rates, where the new national rates are being applied. Now, they are applied nationally. They're also applied in some of the combined authorities, but not all. So you've got to understand that if you go on to find a learning aim, if it doesn't indicate your combined authority or your devolved authority, it means they apply the national rate. Now, it's usually the new national rate. Check on that, but it usually is. Now, if you look at that difference, access to HE radiography is now, for each individual that completes that program and passes, you're going to get £1,656 more for that learner compared to what you got before 24-25. These changes, by the way, were introduced in 24-25. Just think about that. Now, you might say, well, therefore, we can get our allocation used up quicker because each learner is worth more. Well, the reason each learner is worth more is to try and reflect that the funding rates have not changed since 2010-11. So it was a bit of catch up. You know, we haven't had any inflation proofing in adult skills over the last 10 or so years. It also means that you can obviously achieve things like viability on fewer learners because you're actually getting more per learner. But that also is going to be balanced out by the fact that your costs have gone up as well. So, you know, there are all these pluses and minuses. Now, when we ever want to do the viability of an access to HE provision, which is not one of the aims today, you have to really factor in which of our learners are funded nationally, right? Which ones are funded by devolved authority because you operate next door to a devolved authority, and you might have learners coming from a devolved authority who are residents of that authority. They might have a different rate. You're trying to work out, well, if I'm doing an access to radiography program, and I know that each completion is worth £5,040, then if I've got a target of 16 learners, 16 learners will bring me about £80,000. But then I've got to say, well, but it's costing me £80,000 to just deliver the program. You know, that number of hours plus all the material costs, etc. So that's still how you work out your viability. It's slightly easier now to have a better handle on viability because at least most of the rates have gone up. Any access student hasn't got English and Maths. Now, I know usually we're covering this through the pre-access provision, but on occasions we have had learners that have missed that and still haven't got the English and Maths they need for progression to HE. Then those are currently funded at £811 using the old methodology. Functional skills are funded less, £724. Digital skills have gone up. But any learner that needs to do any type of stepping stone qualifications, they still use they'll use the new methodology. If covered by the national rate, if they're not, then they'll be covered by the old matrix. And that means you'd have to use the number of hours. Most English and Maths would have been weighted at A. Now, there are some opportunities, it's very rare, where we've got learners who are not doing a regulated Maths and English qualification, but they don't normally appear in the pre-access or access provision. It's just something to be aware of as possibly a part of the progression route into a pre-access program. Now, one or two of you asked about learning support. Just to cover it, it's not pastoral support, it's not tutorial. It's basically for those learners that without the learning support, they would not be able to complete the program. And we always assume that what we call maintenance support is provided to all learners, irrespective of ages, the conversation with the teacher, the pastoral care that a teacher or tutor would provide, that's part of the core funding. This is £150 per month once you've identified the need and provided the support. If in any particular month, for example, when they're coming into assessment time, or maybe in the first month of an access program, they might need more, then you can claim more through what we call the excess learning support. Have a chat with your MI manager about claiming more, but you'd have to have evidence. So if I wanted to claim £400 in 1 month, then I would claim 150 through the ILR and the 250 through excess support. But obviously, we always take account of, that's assuming you always spend at least £150 a month. So something to be aware of. But again, don't forget, if you invest in the learning support for access to HE students, they're more likely to complete and they're more likely to pass. And so I think it's very important that that's identified as early as possible. And it is fundable out of your allocation, or obviously if it's separate through a learning, through a procurement, then identify it. This is very similar to the bursary support for any of your loan-funded learners. That's a question that one of you has already asked. Do loan-funded learners get learning support? They do, as long as you've got a loans bursary fund allocation. So you've got to make sure you identify how much you think you need for loan-funded learners to complete the programs. And again, that's funded at £150 per month. Yep. And discretionary learner support, again, this is childcare, materials, exam fees. And again, this is out of your allocation. You can operate your own system, your own scheme. But basically, once you've used up all of your discretionary learner support money, that's it. You haven't got anything else other than maybe to bring it from your own resources, such as maybe if you're doing, profit earning activities through an activity, you might be able to divert some of that money into discretionary learner support. So again, this is one area that is not as well exploited in terms of funding for access to HE students. And of course, very often, that stops them either starting the programme or completing it successfully. Now, the thing about earnings in the ASF is that if we go back to that example, the Access to Medicine Diploma, 7 months long, 80% of funding is attached to retention, that's per month. So each month, you will indicate on the ILR that the person is still present, and you earn £504. The first month, you earn a double payment. This is what they call N+1, because they assume that in the first month of anyone starting a program, particularly a longer program, the adults will need quite a lot of help with orientation, with guidance, their induction, etc. So that's why you've got that double earning in the first month. And then, of course, when you've got evidence of completion of the diploma, the achievement of the level 3 diploma, then you will get the completion payment of £1,008. Again, you claim that through the appropriate methodology. The one thing to note is, if you've got an adult, by the way, who starts an access course and then gets to Christmas and says, "Nah, I've had enough," and basically doesn't complete the course, just simply withdraws, in effect, you will have earned month 1, month 2, month 3, maybe month 4, but you would certainly have lost 5, 6, and 7, and in some cases 4, 5, 6, and 7. So a non-completion on programme funding will lose you almost £2,000. And then, of course, the non-completion will lose you another £1,000 on top. So you can see built into this methodology for adults, and it's the same for loan-funded learners, except with loan-funded learners, there's no completion element. There's what they call a quality assurance bit. It links up to the quality of your provision, the quality of your support. And if you get the quality of support wrong, quality of teaching wrong, in many cases, the learners will not be retained. However, there are other reasons why adults are not retained. It could be a change in family conditions. It could be, a lack of confidence. It could be a personal problem. It could be moving to a different part of the country. So just be aware of that. So they can impact on your funding. Now, I mentioned devolution because many of you are listening in are in devolved authorities, and that was very much about this taking spending decisions and delegating them to the appropriate local authorities to meet their individual needs. They're much more specific, what we call space needs or place needs. So it's reflecting. About 60% of the ASF was delegated 24-25, 25-26, it's almost 70%. 3 more devolved authorities. I'll give you an example of what's happening in East Midlands counties. 2 funds, education and training, tailored learning, which is what they support for community learning. It was also get free courses for jobs offer, meets the needs of those learners without a first level 3, which has been extended now to include more people, as we said. And of course, a lot of that is going into statutory requirements. So lots of, it depends very much on what's been identified. In some cases, Greater Manchester, access to health and social care is a priority. So they want to see more provision in that area. In others, they might give you a 10% increase in your funding. So for example, if you look at Cornwall is often, council is often inflating. Sorry, it's not inflating, it's enhancing the rate of funding in some key areas, such as access to HE level 3 programs. West Midlands Combined Authority includes some access to HE diplomas in its free courses for jobs offer. Innovative approaches to access to HE, for example, where you've maybe designed an access program to facilitate access to, for example, like higher apprenticeships, as opposed to a traditional higher education route. So there's all kinds of things that can happen, but be aware that obviously that reflects very much the priorities in your local area. And in some cases, access to HE is not as well understood as maybe other level 3 programs. In some cases, it's well understood, and it's part and parcel of the determination to actually see it increase in quantity. So here's some examples where access to HE, I mentioned combined, South Yorkshire combined, access to HE was important because there are not enough adults in South Yorkshire have got level 4 qualifications and above. And obviously, if you can get them through access to HE, it might do. As I said, access to HE diplomas are in the West Midlands areas, are in the free courses for jobs offer, but also in a 10% uplift. So there you are, 10% more than the rate that would normally be offered in the West Midlands. And in the GLA, again, a part of the regional flexibility that was being used in London. So those learners that are not funded by those devolved authorities, you'll often find they've got different rates. Now, I'm going to mention loans because I know that for many of you, you're still using the Student Loans Company to fund a lot of your adults on access to HE provision. But it'll be interesting to see what happens when I think generally the low take-up of loans, the total loans facility across England is about £500 million. Only 50% of it is taken up. And a much smaller percentage of that is taken up by colleges. A bigger proportion is taken up by private, independent and private training providers. We know that they're not means tested. They're only available for certain qualifications. Now, obviously, when you go on to FALA, Final Learning Aim, you put in your access course, you'll come down to loans funded, and it will tell you what the rate is, right? And usually it's funded under the old, matrix rate, which is very important. That means that loan-funded learners are not as well funded as ASF-funded learners. I didn't know that. Just remember that. They haven't caught up yet. The normal rules apply. A student can have up to 4 loans at one time or consecutively, but they can only have one access to HE loan. That means they can still have 3 other loans, but only one can be used for an access to HE program. Now, as you know, loan-funded learners who complete an access course, if they then go on to complete an HE program, also have their access to HE diploma written off. So that's quite important. That's quite an important incentive there for learners who are loan-funded. You don't complete the loan application, you simply guide them towards it. Again, check which qualifications are loan-funded. And of course, the loan amount is the one that appears on Final Learning Aim, which unfortunately is the old rates, that 3,022 and going up. Payment stops at the point the learner withdraws. You have to tell the Student Loans Company, and they will then terminate the payments to you from that next month onwards. The learner will have to repay what they've already had. Of course, they do repay the loan once they reach the earnings threshold later on. And of course, any adult who uses a loan to fund their access program is also eligible to be funded through an advanced learner loan bursary fund, as long as you've indicated how much you think you're going to need for the year to fund it. So here are some of the tail end sort of conclusions to what's happening. First of all, access diplomas have not been included in review of qualifications at level 3 for defunding purposes, so that takes a bit of pressure off us. Not all pre-access provision will be eligible because, of course, some of those quals are at level 2 and below, except for English, maths, functional skills, digital skills, but they might not continue to be as well funded or funded at all. I'm particularly worried about generic employability skills and things like personal social development. So just watch out for that. Again, check with Ascentus what continues to be eligible and at what rate. You always need to compare the new rates with the old rates, which I did show you that before. And of course, your additional hours, if you were offering an access diploma in 540 hours, now you're doing it in 600 hours, you can obviously use any blend of hours to achieve the given rate of funding. The expectation is most devolved authorities would set similar rates to DfE. That has not happened, and I'll show you in a minute. But there's also another concern, and that is how do devolved authorities view access to HE provision? And one of you has asked that question. We don't know yet what's been identified in Lincolnshire. Now, we know that there's some rumours going around about ESOL not being funded or not counting as a priority in that particular devolved authority, and something similar might happen in others. So I think there's always that. For me, the most important is if you're a provider, make sure that you're, whatever the devolved authority is, whether it's a county council or a new strategic authority, that you keep on telling them about access to HE. Ascentus will, but you should you as the providers, particularly identify which groups of learners would not be coming into education, particularly to progress to level 4 and above. That's the important message, would be the case. The rates only apply to those with, the new rates only apply to those of 19 to 23. The adult skip, the funding for free courses for jobs offer will obviously account for some of those who are over the age of 23. And who don't, by the way, even if they've got a degree, and they might have a degree in philosophy or economics or business studies and want to retrain into education or into health and social care, if it's under the free courses for jobs offer, the extended offer, and it's in a key sector, they will be fully funded. So always refer to the Find a Learning Aim for any questions that you might have. And just to highlight that issue that I've raised several times, but it's important to note that in the devolved authorities, you can have quite different rates of funding. Now, I've chosen access to HE Diploma in Education. The new national rate is 600 hours at £7.20. So that gives you £4,320. Greater Manchester is still using the old methodology. It's 3,600. It's the same diploma, but just delivered to a resident of Greater Manchester. So just imagine that you might be operating in what do you call it, Staffordshire or some area outside of Manchester, Lancashire, but you've got a student who actually lives in Greater Manchester, but comes to you because you're the nearest provider and you're not in Greater Manchester, is that they would be bringing less than someone from Lancashire. They're doing the same qual. In the West Midlands, again, they have different rates, 3,797. The West of England Combined Authority offers more. So that's interesting. They're offering more than the national rate. Wow. Now, by the way, the question that you always get is, well, I come from, York and North Yorkshire. Well, if they're not there, they're using the national rates. West Yorkshire, they're using the national rate. South Yorkshire, using the national rate. So that's always the default situation. But what you'll notice is if you've got a loan funded learner, it's still the old matrix weighted by uplifted for education, which is weighted at B. That's 3,384. Look at the difference. That's almost £1,000 less than a learner on the same course funded nationally or by the DWP or in some other combined authorities or devolved authorities. Now, I did the same for business studies. Business studies access to HE diploma, 4,320. Cornwall, same diploma, 5,184. Greater Manchester, 3,218. It's £1,000 less. West Midlands, 3,391. West of England, 4,536. It's worth visiting Fala to find out what's happening in those combined authorities. So hopefully this will help you to maximise the funding for your access to HE provision, knowing about what's happening nationally, but also locally. Find out in a devolved authority have a look at the most recent publication on roles, priorities, their plans. What do they see as the importance of access to HE if they do? Understanding how the rates can differ between national and devolved arrangements. Use different modes of delivery to reflect different needs. We're increasingly putting much more blended distance learning, open learning in. A lot of access students will need childcare, study skills, pre-access provision, goes back to what you mentioned about pastoral care, etc. Make sure you focus on retention achievement, as well as making the best use of your learning support and learner support funding. Question there, can access courses be delivered in 375 hours? I think the danger here is, if the assumption is that 600 hours, then basically we used to have a rule that says, and this was particularly a rule that was applied, is now being applied in devolved authorities, that you've got to be at least within 75% of that. In some, it's 90%. So you could possibly get away with 500 or 400, 540 hours. I think 375 would be difficult, particularly if you're saying that that would enable the person to get the full 60 credits that they need, or whatever the number of credits is. But how do you deliver that unless you're delivering a significant amount of it through blended learning or making some assumptions about the prior learning? So I would maybe that might be subject to some look at by audit. But if you said 375 hours of face-to-face plus so many hours of online learning, I wouldn't have a problem with it, as long as we get within that sort of 500-hour mark. I know that one of the combined authorities will fund it at the lower level. Good, that's good. So it's face-to-face plus online, so that answers the question. But I know that there's one combined authority, which is if it's done in less than 75 hours, 75% of the hours, which would be 450, they actually bring it down to a lower load band. So they don't fund it at the full rate. They'll fund it they'll multiply whatever the actual hours by £6, £7.20 or £8.40, not the 600. So you'd actually only get 475 hours multiplied by either £6, £7.20, £8.40, depending on which. So hopefully that answers that question. Thanks for that. So those are the final points I was going to make. Hopefully that's given you a sense of what's happening, but there's a lot to watch out for. We need to know what the DWP is going to operate, how it's going to operate, how is it going to link up with Skills England, which is identifying, how is it going to link up with a white paper, post-16 white paper. A lot of this is in relation to getting Britain working again, so reducing the number of people out of work. How are we going to use it to target the 900,000 NEETs? You know, it's the 16 to 21s that are not in any form of education or training. Is there a different role for access to HE? Maybe we should be talking about 2-year access programs where you cover a lot of these things and engage people again. But of course, a lot of this will now rest with the devolved authorities. You know, almost 70% of adults will now be covered by devolved authorities. So that does mean we have to really understand what the implications are in your area, particularly of a devolved arrangement. So good luck to those of you who are just moving into new devolved arrangements.